Hello friends and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where 3 certified Pro Tools experts discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in the official Avid Facebook support forum. I'm your host Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer based in the UK, and today we're going to be looking at a question from Elijah, who asks, does Pro Tools automatically export with Dither on? If so, how can I turn it off? I use Ableton usually, and there's a way to turn the Dither off, and I wanted to know if I can do the same thing in Pro Tools.
Excellent question.
It's a really good question.
So we're going to discuss what Dither is, when to use it, and how Pro Tools deals with dithering, and probably a whole load more beside. And to answer this question for us are 2 men who may or may not dither in other senses of the word. Please welcome Anders Motz from Tonkraftwerk in Austria.
Hello.
And Andy Hageman all the way over in Tokyo.
How's it going?
So dither is one of those divisive subjects, isn't it? When you have a subject that deals with adding specific low-level noise to your bounces, although Andy will probably tell us he might not like using the term noise, it's going to rile a few people up, right?
Well, so I think noise is probably the best word that we have out there for it, right? It is a specific kind of noise, right? It's not pink noise, it's not white noise, it's not traffic noise. It's a specific kind of noise added to a signal to do a specific thing, right? So, but I'm cool with the word noise because I don't think that we have any better word for it other than dither itself.
Yeah, and it's a great question that Elijah asks, and I think we've discussed a couple of great subjects here, but this is one that a lot of people get wrong, what it is, how to use it, and also how Pro Tools deals with it. So it will be really interesting to explore this.
Yeah. So who would like to start with discussing what dither is?
Should I do like a quick explanation? I have someone is drilling just above me, I think. Sorry about that.
Go for it.
Sure,
yeah.
Drilling. Of course, that was what that sounded like.
Yeah,
of course, we all believe you.
Too much baked beans for lunch. Okay, so basically there is one specific... Great. This will take an hour for me to explain.
This guy's nothing. We've been on the stream for half an hour. This guy's done nothing for half an hour.
Right.
Okay. So there is one specific situation where you will need to add dither to your mix, and that is when you're going from 24 or 32-bit floating point down to 16-bit, and only at that point you would need it. And basically when you're going from a higher bit depth, where you have a higher dynamic range than the 16-bit depth where the dynamics is lower, basically Pro Tools has to truncate or resample, but what's the best word to explain this? It basically has to translate that higher dynamic range to lesser information.
It has to fit 24 bits into a 16-bit space.
Exactly. And where you have maybe in 24 bits where you have very, very small variations, you might end up with where it should be very small variations in dynamics. You might end up with a straight line, and that straight line, of course, will be distortion, or you will hear it. Even though it's on very low volume, you can still hear this straight line, basically the same amount of loudness as distortion. Usually you will hear it when there's a cymbal ringing out or a piano being held and it's sustained, and all of a sudden you will hear that. So what we do is we put in a dither plugin that creates a very specific type of noise to mask these straight lines with basically a little bit of variation in loudness. So as Andy said prior to us recording this, he said we are getting rid of distortion, and as the downside we add a little bit of noise.
Right. So I'll agree with you on one thing, and I'll take a small issue with another thing.
Yep.
I think we should never use the word sample or resample specifically
Yeah,
when we're talking
you're-
about Dither, because your sample rate has nothing to do with Dither. It's a completely different thing. But when you truncate data, so by the way, if anybody deals with any other kind of data, Dither is not just an audio thing, right? So when you go from a larger bit depth to a smaller bit depth, you remove the least significant bits, right? So when we've got in audio, we've got a 24-bit word, and and then what we're going to do is we're going to take away the 8 least significant bits to give us a 16-bit word. Well, that loss of data itself will cause distortion. Okay, and as beyond that, I agree with everything that Anders has said. Is that when we remove that data, new distortion is going to be added to the signal because of the data truncation. And the way that we get rid of it is to apply this extremely specific, extremely low-level, randomish noise to the signal. Are we adding noise to the signal? Yes, that's the cost, right? But the benefit is that distortion is gone, right? So that distortion is no longer an issue, and things like reverb tails and soft piano notes as they fade into silence will actually do what they're supposed to do, right? And the price we pay for it is that additional dither noise.
Yeah, thank you for correcting me there, Andy. That's much more well put, of course. And of course, the only time you would use this is also when this is the last thing that you do. If you're going to send your audio files to a mastering engineer or add some kind of compression afterwards or something, don't dither. Because you will just mess up the signal even more, making that noise even louder or more audible.
Yeah, indeed. So this is a mastering step. This is something that mix engineers don't necessarily need to deal with.
Yeah,
exactly.
What I do usually is I will mix and output my mix in the bit depth that I've recorded in, and I'll send that to the mastering engineer so that he can do all of his compression and limiting and EQing, and then as he goes out of his mastering platform, he will then use Dither to when he's truncating.
It's very similar to how I think about sample rates. I don't like unnecessary conversions. So I like working in specific sample rates, quite high. Working 32-bit, 24-bit is the same thing. If the product is going to be going off to a 24-bit distribution, record it in 24-bit or 32-bit, because as we're going to discover, we don't necessarily need to do any dithering when we're converting from 32-bit to 24-bit. Do we?
That's right.
And it's similar with sample rates for me. If it's going to be going off to for 96K delivery, record it in 96K, and then everything below that can be taken as a derivative from that. We're not upsampling, and it's kind of similar with bit depths.
Yeah, and I think you're mentioning sample rates here, and it's very important to not add to confusion here. We're not talking.
No.
There's no need to add dither when you're going from one sample rate to another.
No.
It's only when you're going from a higher bit depth, 24, 32 down to 16.
Now, if you're going the other direction, if you're for whatever reason going from a lower bit depth to a higher bit depth, also no need. There's no data being truncated. Therefore, there's no data being truncated. That means there's no distortion from that truncation. That means that dither, if you added it, would do you no good.
Yes. So sample rate is not a consideration whatsoever. It's only when we are moving from a higher bit depth down to a lower bit depth.
That's
There's
right.
no other situations.
No other situation.
What would you do if you had recorded in 96K and you need to 24 bits and you need to your final destination is CD 44.1 16-bit? How would you go about doing that?
Okay, that's a good question. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to resample it. So you do your sample conversion first.
So
and then
basically, you bounce to disk, going from 96 to 44.1, still being in 24-bit or 32.
This is a minute difference, but it's the best practice, right? So if you're going to do sample rate and bit depth reduction, right, which is not uncommon, then it is recommended that you do these in two separate stages. The first stage is going to be to do your sample rate conversion. So if you wanted to do, what's your target sample rate?
44.1.
Okay, so 44.1. You're recording at 96 kilohertz at 24 bits. So you're going down to 44.1. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, without dither, I'm going to go from 96K sample rate down to a 44.1K sample rate at 24 bits.
Mm-hmm.
So bouncing your master at 44.1.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So I've got a second stage file at 44.1, but still at 24 bits. So I haven't done data truncation. I've resampled, but that's as we've determined that has nothing to do with what dither is. Now, the second thing that I'll do as a separate operation when this is done, and again, this is minute detail, right? I dare most people to hear the difference, but you asked. At that point, when you're done, you've got then a 24-bit file at 44.1. At that point, I'll apply dither, and then go down to 16-bit.
So rebouncing at 16-bit.
Yes. So when you're again, this is best practices. You may hear a difference, you may not, right? But the best practice is when you're reducing sample rates and bit depths is to do them in two stages: sample rate conversion first, and then add dither and bit reduction as a second separate process.
Yep.
Would you agree with that, Andrews?
Totally, it makes totally sense.
Yeah.
And of course, because when you're going from a higher sample rate to a lower, you also end up with some artifacts from that sample rate conversion, of course. And by adding dither at the same time, going to a lower bit depth as well, will actually exaggerate those little artifacts.
Right.
So you might end up with a less than stellar result. Okay, so the question was very specific. Does Pro Tools add dither automatically on export? And if so, can I turn it off? And this is a really, really good question because
Great question.
Because there are also two different operations here at play. There is one operation called export audio, right? And there is one thing called bounce to disk, or bounce mix, as it's been renamed since a couple of Pro Tools versions here. So let's look into this and see when does Pro Tools do what automatically.
Shall I share my screen?
Yeah, that would be great, Andy.
All right. See, Dave, I asked first, then shared my screen so that people can see it.
I'm learning from a master every week.
Oh God! All right, so here's Pro Tools, and I wanted to show a couple of things real quickly. So there's a lot of thought about noise shaping. So this basic what we do to kind of de-emphasize audible noise and emphasize noise where it's less audible. And I'll be honest, it's hard to find good information on this. We've tried to find good information on this, and probably the best information that we found is actually in the Avid curriculum. So Anders, you're an Avid master instructor.
No,
and you have a book in front of you.
I'm just an expert instructor. But basically, you have to think about your mix, how complex the material is in it. And in Power Dither, there are three types, as Andy said, and you usually use type 1 for material that isn't as complex. So for spoken word or just a solo instrument where there is not much dynamic, and so that's generally type 1 would be your best noise shaping there. Go for type 2, which has a psychoacoustically optimized noise shaping curve, and this is for a bit more aggressive stuff here. If you have more complex material in the stereo spectrum and dynamics, such as pop or rock music, usually type 2 would be your best bet there. And type 3 is for really dynamic material that's very stereophonic, complex, such as maybe jazz or orchestral stuff. But it might also work great for pop. So you can see if you hear any difference between type 2 and type 3 and go for the ones that you like the best.
Yeah, the way that I think of it is just type 1 is for things that aren't as complex, and then type 3 is for things that are very complex, and then 2 is whatever I deem to be in the middle.
Yeah.
I'll be honest though, I haven't used Dither in a dog's age, because if you're going to send something out to a mastering engineer, don't do any data truncation first of all, and if you're not going to do that, don't Dither, right? So, so again, this is something that you should do when you're mastering your own stuff, and in that case, only when you're doing data reduction. Now, there's one other situation where Dither comes into play, maybe without people knowing, and this goes to the original question. So I'll show my session again.
Yeah, and by the way, even if you need to dither and you can't hear any artifacts, basically maybe you shouldn't dither at all times. So I talked to a mastering engineer a couple of weeks ago, and he told me that he doesn't always dither when going from 24 to 16, only when he needs to.
And that's why it's such a divisive subject, isn't it? It's
it is a tricky one, right? Now, so when you bounce, I'll ask you guys this: when you bounce to disk, is dither ever automatically applied?
No.
Has that always been the case?
Yes.
Well,
Actually,
as far as I know.
Actually, no. So back in the old days of DigiDesign, we actually had a dithered mixer, which actually did add dither. So we had mixer plugins, basically, which were the mix engine of Pro Tools, and you could use a dithered mixer or a non-dithered mixer, and it was I think generally unpopular because people were we were adding dither without people knowing about it, because that was in the mix engine. So that since for many years it has not been the case. So for as long as anybody can realistically remember, Pro Tools does not and has not dithered, except for in the distant past, when you bounce. Now,
but let me just add one little side note here, and that is if you're still using a TDM system, and the TDM system has a limited bandwidth between the DSP processors. So every time you're running stuff between different processors on the TDM card, Pro Tools actually dithers between those processors without asking you about it. So
that's right.
Do you know what, Andy? Anders is such a show-off.
Sorry about that. You can cut this off if you want.
Not at all. This is good stuff. So I have a couple of examples here. So this is, and all of them look silent, right? So all of these are silent bits of audio that have been brought out of and then brought back into Pro Tools in a number of different ways. So this session right now, if you take a look at my session setup, is a 48 kilohertz 24-bit session. The sample rate we don't care about, but the bit depth we do. So 24 bits, right? Now, this first file is a file that I bounced to disk to a 16-bit file. So my bounce settings were 16-bit. Should I have put dither on here? Yes. Did I put dither on here? No. So if I take this file and I'm going to go to my audio suite, I'm going to go to normalize. Come on. There we go. So let's normalize this one. Bump. And it's still silent. So no dither was added when I bounced to disk, even when I was reducing my bit depth. This second one is a bounce again at 24-bit. And of course, this one should not have had dither put on it because it's a 24-bit session, 24-bit bounce. And if I click this, come on, Also, it's still silent. No dither has been added. This is a 16-bit export. Now, this is a silent file that from my clips list, I right-clicked and I exported the clips as files. Okay? And it never asked me if I wanted to add dither. This is something Pro Tools does automatically whenever you reduce your bit depth. So in this case, this is a 16-bit file export from a 24-bit session. I hit render on here. I'm going to normalize, and boom, you see there's my dither. Okay. Now this last one is going to be a 24-bit export from the clips list. Now this is 24-bit. My session's 24-bit. So hopefully, Pro Tools is not going to add dither to this. And if I hit render, you'll see that it doesn't. Okay, which is good. So Pro Tools is, generally speaking, doing everything that you want it to do. Now the only thing is it possible to export a clip without dither?
Can we consolidate?
There's one workaround that I can think of. Consolidate is possible, but remember, if you do that, then it's not, well, it'll be the clip. So yeah, consolidate would do it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you wanted to have it, you could go to bounce track. You could do a track bounce,
or
and
just
then
clip bounce it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you'd select the area and then you bounce this track. But I think consolidate is probably the way you want to go.
But you're not changing the bit depth with the consolidate.
It's a one for
track
one.
bounce. So what about track bounce? Have you tried it using track bounce? Does it
Yes.
automatically dither?
No, it does not.
No.
Yeah,
So-
and I did check it.
Yeah, so great stuff. So now we know that Pro Tools doesn't add dither when you bounce stuff, but it adds dither when going from a higher bit depth to a lower when you're exporting stuff out of the clips list. That's really, really good to know. And as a side note, we can now see the dither, how it looks, and we can also take a listen to it.
Sure. We could. It's going to sound a little bit like this.
That's really unpleasant.
It is. It's super unpleasant. It's also
Grammy.
massively louder than it would normally be in a mix.
Yeah, of course. We're talking about like the very least amount of audio moving here. Great. Thanks for clarifying this, and I think that's
It's such a good question, and it's a question, by the way, that I think a lot of people who are even experienced professionals maybe don't necessarily completely understand themselves. I mean, I know I didn't until I did some specific research on it, and of course, one of the big helps for that was the Avid curriculum. So that does help, but it's you talk to a lot of professionals and you get a lot of different answers, and they're not all 100% accurate. So this is a great question. Thank you for giving the opportunity for allowing us to talk about it.
Well, let's give Elijah's question a little bit of context, because the reason that it's being asked is because in the preferences for things like Ableton and Logic, there's a checkbox that says, "Do you want dithering applied?" And that was definitely a cello.
That was a cello, right? Because it's going up a fourth.
yeah.
It's a checkbox you turn on or off. So if you don't know what dither is and you don't know that you've got a checkbox turned on, you're going to be dithering whether you want to or not. And
That's right.
One of the beauties with Pro Tools is that it makes you do things manually. The software's not making the decisions for you or taking the decisions away from you. You have to manually put the plugin on your main output fader, master fader, or if you're going from an auxiliary directly to disk, you put it on the last insert on your output.
That's right. No, that's the one thing about Pro Tools, right? This is a larger philosophical discussion, is that, you have a lot of flexibility. You have flexibility to do just about anything you can think of, but you also have the responsibility to understand the tools that you're working with, and Dither is just one of many that people demand answers to.
Well put.
Okay. So I think we've done as much as we can there, right?
I think it's a good one. I think it's a good, solid 12-minute discussion.
Done in an hour.
So I'm going to be truncating 50
truncating a lot,
down to
maybe.
12.
No, but I think it's all right. I mean, a 12-minute episode is still, it's a great format.
I think the more targeted we get stuff, and of course we should stop recording because this is just a general conversation.
Yeah, so let's do the off thing. Let's.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing.
So thanks so much, Elijah, for the question. Really interesting discussion. Thank you very much to you, Anders and Andy, for going through that in such depth with us as well. Really interesting subject. If you got a lot out of the video, please hit like. If you want to follow a lot more of what we're doing here at Pro Tools Answers, please subscribe to the channel. You can also head over to protoolsanswers.com where you can subscribe to us over there as well. And if you fancy tossing us a couple of bucks, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers. We would definitely appreciate your support. All leaves me to say is thank you very much to Anders.
Thank you.
And thank you to Andy.
You bet.
My name's Dave. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're out.